Christmas 1515, while thousands knelt in frozen churches praying for salvation. The most powerful priest in England was tucking his illegitimate son into bed. The same man who condemned sinners from golden pulpits was raising two bastard children in secret. One became a teenage millionaire through church corruption. The other was hidden in a convent, erased from history. Their mother sold off like livestock when she became inconvenient. This is Cardinal Wolsey's family, the heirs he could never claim, the scandal that helped destroy the Catholic Church in England. Since it's Christmas, here's a question for you. If you had Wolsey's power, would you break your vows for love? Or would you stay loyal to the church? Drop your answer in the comments. I actually read them. And if you want more dark Tudor secrets they buried, hit subscribe. Trust me, this channel is about to blow up in 2026, and you'll want to be here for it. Also, real talk. What kind of dark history do you want me to cover next? More Tudors? Medieval torture? Survival stories? Comment below and I'll make it happen. Now, let me tell you about the priest who preached celibacy while his teenage son was robbing the church blind. This gets dark. Let's go. The year is 1473. A boy is born above a butcher's shop in Ipswich blood on his father's apron. The smell of death in the air. No one could have imagined that this child, Thomas Wolsey, would one day hold England in the palm of his hand. But ambition has a way of turning butchers' sons into kings of men. By 1509, Wolsey had clawed his way into the royal court as Henry VIII as almoner, the man who distributed the king's charity. It was a modest position, a foot in the door. But Wolsey didn't want a foot in the door. He wanted to tear the door off its hinges. Within 6 years, he did exactly that. By 1515, Thomas Wolsey was no longer just a priest. He was the Bishop of Lincoln, the Archbishop of York, a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, and then the ultimate prize Lord Chancellor of England. Second only to the king himself, he controlled everything: politics, the church, foreign policy. Wars were decided at his desk. Marriages were arranged by his word. Treaties were signed with his seal. If Henry VIII was the face of England, Wolsey was the brain. And he lived like it. Hampton Court Palace, one of the most magnificent buildings in Europe, wasn't built for the king. It was built for Wolsey. 500 rooms, golden plates at every meal, servants in silk livery, tapestries imported from France. He moved through the world like royalty, surrounded by wealth that would make emperors jealous. When Wolsey entered a room, men fell silent. When he spoke, kings listened. He was untouchable, unstoppable, the most powerful man in England who wasn't wearing a crown. But power has a price, and for Wolsey, that price was truth. Because while he stood in golden robes, preaching reform from the highest pulpits in the land, condemning sin, and calling for moral purity within the church, he was living a lie so enormous it would eventually consume him. He preached celibacy. He demanded obedience to holy vows. He punished priests who strayed from their sacred duties. And all the while, behind closed doors, he had already broken the most fundamental vow a priest could take. By the time Wolsey became Lord Chancellor, the secret was already 10 years old. Whispers had begun to spread through the corridors of power. Foreign ambassadors mentioned it in their letters home. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Servants gossiped in the kitchens. Everyone knew. No one dared speak, because the man who preached purity had a mistress. And with her, he had done the unthinkable. He had children. 2 of them. Hidden, denied, but undeniably his. This is where the story truly begins. Not with Wolsey's rise to power, but the woman who shared his bed while he told the world he served only God. Her name was Joan Lark, and she would become the mother of the heirs Wolsey could never claim. Joan Lark was not supposed to matter. Born around 1490 in the coastal town of Yarmouth, Norfolk, She came from a family that existed somewhere in the murky space between respectable and unremarkable. Her father, Peter Lark, has been described in different records as a Thetford innkeeper, a London common councilman, even a Huntingdonshire gentleman. The truth is probably simpler. He was a man of modest means, trying to secure his family's future. But Joan had something her father's money couldn't buy: connections. Her uncle was Joan Lark, a man who would later be remembered as Blessed Joan Lark, a martyr for the Catholic faith. Her brother, Thomas Lark, had climbed the ranks of the church to become canon of Bridgenorth, and eventually a chaplain to one of the most powerful men in England, Thomas Wolsey. It's unclear exactly how Joan and Wolsey met. Perhaps through her brother. Perhaps at court, where ambitious families sent their daughters hoping to catch the eye of powerful men. What is clear is that by 1509, when Wolsey became almoner to the new young King Henry, Joan Lark had become more than an acquaintance. She had become his mistress. This wasn't a brief affair hidden in shadows. Joan didn't visit Wolsey in secret or meet him in darkened rooms for stolen moments. She lived with him, openly, at Bridewell Palace, one of the royal residences Wolsey had claimed for his own use. Joan Lark moved through the halls as if she belonged there, because in his world, she did. As servants knew, the courtiers knew. Foreign ambassadors writing reports back to their kings mentioned the cardinal, swoman as if it were common knowledge. And it was. This was ante-secret in the way secrets are meant to be kept. It was an open truth that everyone agreed not to acknowledge out loud. Joan was intelligent enough to understand her position. She wasn't Wolsey's wife. She could never be his wife. The church forbade it. His vows forbade it. But in practice, she lived as if those vows didn't exist. And then the inevitable happened. She became pregnant. In 1510, she gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after his father, though he would never carry the Wolsey name. Instead, he became Thomas Winter. A deliberate distortion. A thin disguise that fooled no one. 2 years later, in September of 1512, Joan gave birth again. This time, a daughter, Dorothy. Now Wolsey had a problem. One illegitimate child could be dismissed as a youthful indiscretion. 2 children meant a pattern, a relationship, a family. For a man who preached that priests should remain celibate and pure, this was more than hypocrisy. It was betrayal. Of his vows, of his position, of the very institution he represented. But Joan Lark wasn't the villain of this story. She was a woman trapped in an impossible situation, tied to a man who could give her everything except legitimacy. She bore his children, shared his bed, lived in his palaces. But she would never be acknowledged, never be honored, never be anything more than a shadow in his life. And the cruelest irony? Her own uncle would one day die for the Catholic faith, martyred for refusing to abandon the church. While Joan lived in open sin with one of its most powerful leaders. The contradictions were staggering. But in Wolsey's world, contradictions didn't matter. Only power did. Thomas Winter never stood a chance at a normal life. From the moment he drew his first breath around 1510, his existence was a carefully managed secret. Not hidden, exactly, but obscured. Reframed. Wrapped in layers of plausible deniability that allowed everyone to pretend they didn't know the truth. He was sent to live with a family in Willesden, a village north of London, far enough from court to avoid constant scrutiny, close enough for Wolsey to visit when the mood struck him. The boy grew up in comfort, surrounded by tutors and servants, educated like the son of a nobleman. Because that's what he was, just not officially. Wolsey visited when he could, brought gifts, ensured the boy wanted for nothing. Strangers who saw them together might have assumed Thomas was a nephew, a godson, the child of a distant relative being raised under the cardinal's generous patronage. It was a convenient fiction, and it worked for a while. But then came Dorothy. Born on September 29th, 1512, she represented a different kind of problem. A son could be explained away with vague references to family obligation. A daughter was harder to justify. Girls didn't inherit church positions. They couldn't be quietly tucked into clerical roles and forgotten. Dorothy needed to disappear. So Wolsey arranged for her adoption. John Clancy, an alderman of Worcester, a man of standing, someone trustworthy, agreed to take the child and raise her as his own. She became Dorothy Clancy. The Wolsey name was scrubbed from her identity before she was old enough to understand what it meant. And just like that, she vanished from her father's world. There's no record of Wolsey visiting her. No letters. No gifts. If he thought of her at all, it was as a problem solved. A loose end tied off. She was safe, provided for, and most importantly silent. 2 children. 2 entirely different strategies for managing the scandal. Thomas was kept close, showered with opportunities, groomed for a future within the church. His existence was an open secret, acknowledged through whispers and knowing glances, but never directly confronted. Dorothy was erased, handed off to strangers, hidden behind a different surname, raised in obscurity far from the glittering world her father inhabited. The contrast was brutal, and it revealed something essential about Wolsey's character. He loved his son, or at least, he loved what his son represented. Legacy, continuation. A version of himself that could carry forward into the future, even if that future had to be built on lies. But his daughter? She was a liability, a reminder of his weakness, a crack in the armor of his carefully constructed image. So he did what powerful men have always done when faced with inconvenient truths. He made her someone else's problem. Joan Lark watched all of this happen. Watched her son sent away to Willesden. Watched her daughter handed to strangers in Worcester. She had given Wolsey 2 children, and he had taken them both from her. Not cruelly, not violently, but completely. Because this was never about family. It was about control. About maintaining the illusion of holiness while indulging in the very sins he condemned from the pulpit. Thomas Winter would grow up knowing who his father was, even if he couldn't say it out loud. Dorothy Clancy would grow up not knowing at all. And Joan? She would soon learn that bearing a cardinal's children didn't earn you loyalty. It earned you silence. And eventually, exile. Every Sunday, Cardinal Wolsey stood before congregations and spoke of virtue. He spoke of discipline, of sacrifice, of the sacred duty every priest owed to God to remain pure, celibate, devoted entirely to the spiritual welfare of their flock. He reminded them that a priest's vow of chastity wasn't just tradition. It was divine law. To break it was to betray Christ himself. The crowds listened in reverent silence. They bowed their heads. They prayed. They believed that the man in crimson robes before them was a living example of everything he preached. They had no idea. Wolsey didn't just preach celibacy, he enforced it. As Lord Chancellor and Papal Legate, he held immense authority over the English Church. When priests were accused of keeping mistresses or fathering children, Wolsey was the one who passed judgment. He imposed fines. He issued public rebukes. He preached reform from the highest pulpits in the land, demanding that the clergy live up to the standards God expected of them. And the entire time, his own son was being raised in secret. His own daughter was hidden in a convent. His own mistress was living under his roof. The gap between his words and his actions wasn't just wide, it was a chasm. But here's the thing about hypocrisy at that level. It doesn't happen by accident. It requires deliberate, conscious choice. Every time Wolsey condemned another priest for the same sins he committed, he made a choice. Every time he stood at that pulpit and spoke about purity, knowing his children existed in the shadows, he made a choice. He chose power over honesty, image over integrity. And for years, it worked, because no one dared challenge him. Wolsey was too powerful, too connected, too essential to the king's government. Accusing him openly would have been political suicide. So instead, people whispered. They exchanged knowing looks across banquet tables. Foreign ambassadors included veiled references in their reports home, careful to phrase things in ways that couldn't be quoted directly. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to. It became a kind of collective delusion. The entire English court agreed to ignore the obvious truth sitting right in front of them, because acknowledging it would mean confronting the man who controlled their fates. But whispers have a way of growing louder. By the time Thomas Winter reached his teenage years, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Wolsey didn't just support his son quietly, he showered him with church positions, titles, income, wealth that would make noblemen envious. And every appointment was another crack in the facade. Protestant reformers across Europe were already attacking the Catholic Church for corruption. They pointed to lavish lifestyles, abuses of power, clergy who lived like kings while preaching poverty. Wolsey was handing them ammunition. John Bale, Hugh Latimer, and other English reformers would later use Wolsey's scandal as proof that the entire system was rotten. They asked the questions that mattered. If celibacy was truly sacred, why did it fail so consistently? If priests couldn't control their own desires, how could they guide others toward salvation? And most damning of all, if the most powerful churchman in England could live a double life without consequence, what did that say about the church itself? Wolsey had become a symbol, not of holiness, but of everything wrong with the institution he represented. The irony was almost poetic. A man who spent his life accumulating power within the church would become one of the reasons people lost faith in it. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, Wolsey stood at the peak of his influence, untouchable and unaccountable, and his children grew older in the shadows. By the time Thomas Winter turned 15, he was one of the wealthiest teenagers in England, not through inheritance, not through marriage, through the church. His father had seen to that, Dean of Wells Cathedral, Archdeacon of York, Archdeacon of Richmond, Archdeacon of Cornwall, Provost of Beverley. 5 prestigious positions, 5 steady streams of income, and Thomas Winter held them all simultaneously. He didn't earn them. He didn't compete for them. He certainly didn't have the experience or qualifications to deserve them. But that didn't matter, because his father was Cardinal Wolsey, and in the world Wolsey controlled, merit was optional. Nepotism was not. These weren't honorary titles. Each position came with land, property, and most importantly money. Lots of it. The church collected tithes from parishes, rents from estates, fees from services. All of that wealth flowed upward into the hands of whoever held the title, and Thomas collected it all. He didn't preach sermons. He didn't administer sacraments. He didn't visit the sick or comfort the dying. He didn't do any of the work these positions were supposed to require. He just took the money. This practice had a name: pluralism. Holding multiple church offices at once and collecting income from all of them while performing the duties of none. It was technically illegal under church law, technically condemned by the same reformers Wolsey claimed to support. But laws only matter when someone enforces them. And who was going to enforce them against the son of the most powerful man in England? The system was designed to be abused, and Wolsey abused it masterfully. He used his authority to grant his teenage son positions that older, more qualified priests had spent decades trying to achieve. Men who had devoted their entire lives to the church watched as a boy barely old enough to shave was handed wealth and status they would never see. And they couldn't say a word, because speaking against Thomas meant speaking against Wolsey, and speaking against Wolsey meant ending your career. Or worse, so the whispers continued, courtiers murmured. Ambassadors noted it in their dispatches. The people in the pews, the ones whose tithes funded Thomas Winter's lifestyle, began to notice that their spiritual leaders were more interested in gold than God. It was corruption, blatant, undeniable corruption. and everyone pretended it was normal. Thomas wasn't the only illegitimate son of a churchman to benefit from his father's power. The practice was common enough that historians would later call it systemic. Bishops and cardinals across Europe quietly funneled wealth to their secret children, using the church as a personal treasury. But Thomas Winter's case was different, because it wasn't quiet. Wolsey didn't hide what he was doing. He flaunted it. He gave his son so many positions, collected so much wealth on his behalf, that it became impossible to ignore. It was a declaration, a statement of power. Wolsey was saying, I can break the rules and no one can stop me. And for a long time, he was right. But every empire built on lies eventually collapses. Every system of corruption eventually reaches a breaking point. And when that moment came, when Wolsey's enemies finally found the leverage they needed to bring him down, this would be part of the evidence against him. Not just that he had broken his vows, but that he had used the church, the institution he was supposed to serve, as a personal bank account for his illegitimate child. Thomas Winter lived in luxury. He wanted for nothing. He had wealth, status, security. But he was also living proof of his father's sins. And eventually, that proof would be used against them both. While her brother lived in luxury, Dorothy Clancy disappeared, not literally. She didn't vanish into thin air or flee into exile. But in every way that mattered, she ceased to exist as Wolsey's daughter. The records are sparse. A birth date September 29th, 1512. An adoption John Clancy, alderman of Worcester. And then silence. For years, nothing. No letters survive. No accounts of her childhood. No descriptions of what she looked like, how she spoke, what she thought about the strange circumstances of her life. History swallowed her whole, and what remains is little more than a name and a few scattered references. But we can piece together the outline of her existence. And it's bleak. John Clancy raised her, but we don't know if he was kind, if he resented the arrangement, if he saw her as a daughter or as an obligation imposed by a powerful man he couldn't refuse. Dorothy grew up knowing, or perhaps not knowing, that she was different, that her life had been shaped by forces beyond her control before she could even speak. At some point, she was sent to Shaftesbury Abbey. It was one of the wealthiest convents in England, home to noblewomen and daughters of the elite who had chosen or been chosen for a life of prayer and seclusion. For some women, the convent offered education, community, purpose, a refuge from the brutalities of the outside world. For Dorothy, it was a cage with holy walls, because she didn't choose this life. It was chosen for her, by a father who couldn't acknowledge her, by a society that had no place for illegitimate daughters of powerful men, except in the shadows. Inside those walls, Dorothy would have worn the simple robes of a novice nun. She would have attended prayers, learned scripture, performed the daily rituals that structured convent life. But unlike the other women around her, she carried a secret she may not have fully understood. Her father was Cardinal Wolsey, the second most powerful man in England, and he wanted nothing to do with her. The cruelty of this arrangement is staggering. Thomas Winter was showered with positions and wealth because he was useful. He could carry the Wolsey legacy forward, even if only in secret. He was a son, and sons, even bastard sons, held value. But Dorothy? She was a reminder, a vulnerability. A woman in a world where women, especially illegitimate ones, were liabilities. So Wolsey hid her where no one would look, behind stone walls and locked gates, in a place where silence was a virtue and questions were sins. Did she ever meet her father? Did she know who he was? Did she understand why she had been sent away while her brother lived in comfort? We'll never know. What we do know is this. While Wolsey rose higher and higher, accumulating titles and power and wealth, his daughter grew up in isolation. While Thomas collected money from positions he never worked, Dorothy prayed in a convent she likely never wanted to enter. And when Wolsey's world eventually collapsed, when his enemies came for him, and everything he had built crumbled into ruin, Dorothy was still there, still hidden, still forgotten. Shaftesbury Abbey would eventually be dissolved during the Reformation, its nuns scattered, its wealth seized by the crown. Dorothy would receive a small pension, a bureaucratic gesture of charity from men who owed her father nothing. But that was years away. For now, she was simply a girl in a convent, anonymous, erased, the daughter Cardinal Wolsey never claimed, and never would. In 1519, Joan Lark became a problem, not because she had done anything wrong, not because she had demanded recognition or threatened scandal, but because Wolsey's ambitions had outgrown her. 10 years earlier, when he was merely the king's almoner, having a mistress was a quiet indiscretion. Embarrassing, perhaps, but manageable. But by 1519, Wolsey wasn't just another ambitious priest. He was a cardinal, a papal legate, the Lord Chancellor of England. He was too visible, too scrutinized, too important. And Joan, patient, loyal Joan, who had borne his children and kept his secrets, had become inconvenient. So Wolsey did what powerful men do when faced with inconvenience. He made arrangements. George Legge was a squire from Cheshire, a man of respectable standing with an estate at Adlington Hall. He wasn't nobility, but he was solid, reliable, the kind of man who understood how the world worked and knew better than to ask difficult questions. Wolsey approached him with an offer. Marry Joan Lark, and there would be benefits. A generous dowry. Assistance with property disputes that had been plaguing the Legge family for years. The kind of help that only a man with Wolsey's power could provide. It was a transaction. Clean, efficient, mutually beneficial. Except for Joan. We don't know if she protested. We don't know if she wept or raged or accepted the arrangement with quiet resignation. The records don't care about her feelings. They only care about the outcome. In 1519, Joan Lark married George Legge. She left London, left the palaces and the court and the life she had known for a decade. She traveled north to Cheshire, to a manor house that must have felt like exile. And just like that, the scandal was resolved. Wolsey could tell anyone who asked, if anyone dared to ask, that Joan had moved on, married, settled, no longer part of his life. The whispers didn't stop, of course. People remembered. But memory isn't proof, and Wolsey had plausible deniability now. Joan was someone else's wife, someone else's responsibility. She gave George Legge 4 children over the next 10 years. Elizabeth, Thomas, Mary, Ellen. She played the role of country wife, managing a household, raising a family, attending church on Sundays like any other respectable woman. But she wasn't any other woman. She was the mother of Cardinal Wolsey's children. And that truth followed her everywhere, even if no one spoke it aloud. Did George Legge treat her well? Did he resent her? Did he ever ask about the years before they met? Or did he simply accept the generous terms of their arrangement and look the other way? We'll never know. What we do know is that Joan survived. She built a new life out of the wreckage of the old one. She raised her children, both the ones Wolsey had taken from her and the ones she had with George Legge. She endured. But survival isn't the same as freedom. Because Joan understood something that her children didn't. Something that the courtiers whispering about Wolsey's hypocrisy didn't fully grasp. She understood that powerful men don't love women. They use them. Wolsey had used her body to satisfy desires he was supposed to suppress. He had used her womb to produce children he could never acknowledge. And when she became inconvenient, he used his power to erase her from his life as cleanly as signing a document. She was expendable, replaceable, forgettable. And the worst part? She had known it all along. 10 years of her life, 2 children, a relationship that destroyed any chance she had at a respectable marriage or a normal existence. And in the end, Wolsey traded her away like livestock. In 1529, George Legge died. Joan found herself a widow, approaching 40, with children to support and a past she could never escape. She would remarry within a year. Survival demanded it. But by then, Wolsey's own world was collapsing. And Joan would outlive the man who had controlled her fate for so long. Cardinal Wolsey wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. Because while he stood as the most visible example of clerical hypocrisy in England, he was far from alone. Across the country, behind closed doors and within monastery walls, priests and monks were breaking their vows with such regularity that it had ceased to shock anyone. Celibacy was supposed to be sacred, a sacrifice that demonstrated total devotion to God. But in practice, it had become little more than a suggestion, one that many clergy simply ignored. And the Church? The Church looked the other way. In the 1530s, when Thomas Cromwell began investigating monasteries on behalf of King Henry, what he found was staggering. His agents traveled from abbey to abbey, priory to priory, documenting misconduct in meticulous detail. The reports they compiled became known as the Comperta Monastica, a catalogue of corruption, so extensive it would later be used to justify the dissolution of England's monastic system entirely. The findings were damning. At Woburn Abbey, investigators reported monks living incontinent with women, not in secret, not discreetly, openly enough that the local community knew exactly what was happening behind those holy walls. At Langley Priory, canons kept concubines. Some had fathered children. Some maintained entire second households, funded by church tithes meant for the poor. And these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, repeated across dozens of institutions, in every corner of the country. But here's the darkest part. The Church already knew. For decades, church courts had been fining priests for what they delicately called incontinence. A priest caught with a woman would pay a fee, promise to reform, and be sent back to his parish. No real punishment. No removal from office. Just a fine. And then, a few years later, the same priest would appear in court again. Same offense. Same fine. Same empty promise. It had become a licensing system. Pay your fee, keep your position, continue as before. The system wasn't just broken. It was designed to extract money from misconduct rather than prevent it. And the people in the pews noticed. They saw their priests preaching chastity on Sunday and visiting mistresses on Monday. They paid tithes to support men who lived better than they did while doing none of the spiritual work those tithes were supposed to fund. Trust was eroding. Faith was fracturing. And Wolsey wealthy, powerful, untouchable Wolsey was the face of everything wrong with the institution. But he wasn't the only face. Cardinal Christopher Bainbridge died in 1514, poisoned by his own chaplain. His household had been notorious for excess and rumored relationships that violated every vow he'd taken. Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, surrounded himself with young men he called nephews, though the favoritism he showed them raised questions no one dared ask directly. William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, lived quietly, but rumors persisted about a long-term relationship with a woman in Kent. Nothing proven, nothing acknowledged, just whispers. Even at the parish level, the rot was evident. Thomas Smith, a priest in Hemmingborough, fathered children with multiple women. He was fined repeatedly. He paid repeatedly. And he was never removed. Because removal would mean admitting the system had failed, and the Church couldn't afford that admission. So instead, it pretended. It collected fines and issued rebukes and maintained the illusion of moral authority, even as that authority crumbled from within. Protestant reformers saw all of this. They documented it. They weaponized it. Men like John Bale and Hugh Latimer pointed to Wolsey, the monasteries, to the corrupt parish priests, and asked a simple question. If the men who claim to represent God can't follow their own rules, why should anyone believe them? It was a question the Church couldn't answer. And in the years to come, it would be a question that tore England apart. Power, no matter how absolute, is always temporary. Wolsey learned this the hard way. For nearly 2 decades, he had been untouchable. He controlled policy, manipulated kings, negotiated with emperors. He built palaces that rivaled royal residences. He accumulated wealth that made nobles jealous. He lived as if the rules that governed ordinary men simply didn't apply to him. And for a long time, they didn't. But in 1527, everything began to unravel. The problem wasn't political. It wasn't financial. It was personal. King Henry VIII wanted a son. He needed a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. But his wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. After years of trying, it became clear that Catherine would bear no more children. Henry convinced himself that his marriage was cursed, that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, that the only solution was an annulment, and he needed Wolsey to get it for him. This should have been simple. Wolsey was the papal legate, the Pope's representative in England. He had connections in Rome, influence, leverage. If anyone could secure an annulment, it was him. But there was a complication. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe. And at that exact moment, Charles controlled Rome. His armies occupied the city. The Pope was, effectively, his prisoner. There was no way the Pope would annul Henry's marriage and insult the emperor in the process. Wolsey tried. He negotiated. He maneuvered. He sent envoys and drafted arguments and called in every favor he had accumulated over decades of political scheming. And he failed. Henry grew impatient, then frustrated, then furious. And there was someone whispering in his ear the entire time. Someone who hated Wolsey with a passion that burned hotter than any political rivalry. Anne Boleyn. She was young, intelligent, and ambitious. She had captured the king's obsession completely. And she knew that as long as Wolsey held power, her path to becoming queen would be blocked. So she worked against him, quietly, carefully, poisoning Henry's mind against the man who had once seemed indispensable. By 1529, Wolsey's position had become impossible. He couldn't deliver the annulment. He couldn't satisfy the king. And he had made too many enemies over the years, nobles who resented his power, reformers who despised his hypocrisy, courtiers who saw an opportunity to replace him. In October of that year, Wolsey was stripped of his titles. His properties were seized. His wealth accumulated over decades was confiscated by the crown. Hampton Court Palace, his greatest architectural achievement, became the king's residence. The man who had controlled England was suddenly powerless. He was charged with praemunire, a legal technicality that essentially accused him of putting the Pope's authority above the king's. It was a convenient excuse, a legal fiction designed to justify his destruction. Wolsey knew what was coming next: arrest, trial, almost certainly execution. He retreated north to York, the archbishopric he had held in name, but never actually visited. For the first time in decades, he lived modestly, quietly, like an ordinary priest. But even that wasn't enough. In November 1530, royal agents arrived with orders to bring him to London to face charges of treason. Wolsey never made it. He collapsed during the journey, weakened by stress and illness. He was taken to Leicester Abbey, where he died on November 29th. His last words, recorded by those present, were haunting. "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." It was a confession, an admission of wasted life, of misplaced priorities. But it was also a lie, because Wolsey hadn't served the king diligently, and he certainly hadn't served God. He had served himself, and in the end, had left him with nothing. When Wolsey fell, Thomas Winter lost everything overnight. The church positions his father had given him were stripped away. The income vanished. The protection that had shielded him from scrutiny disappeared. He went from being one of the wealthiest young men in England to being nobody. Just another bastard with a famous name he wasn't allowed to use. He was barely 20 years old. For most of his life, Thomas had lived in a strange kind of limbo, acknowledged privately, denied publicly. Everyone knew who his father was, but no one said it out loud. He had wealth without legitimacy, status without a real identity. And now, even that was gone. But Thomas wasn't abandoned completely. Someone, probably Wolsey himself before his final arrest, had arranged for the boy to leave England, to escape the scandal and the suspicion that would follow anyone connected to the disgraced cardinal. Thomas traveled to Padua, in northern Italy, to study divinity. It was paid for by the king, a final gesture, perhaps, of respect for the man Wolsey had once been. Or maybe just a convenient way to remove a reminder of the cardinal's sins from English soil. Either way, Thomas went into exile. For several years, he lived quietly in Italy, far from the chaos unfolding back home. He studied theology. He learned. He waited for the storm to pass. But storms like that don't pass. They reshape everything in their path. By 1535, Thomas returned to England. Wolsey had been dead for 5 years. The political landscape had shifted entirely. Henry had broken with Rome. The English Reformation was underway. Monasteries were being dissolved, church lands seized, old certainties crumbling. And Thomas Winter came home to find himself penniless. The church positions were long gone. Any inheritance Wolsey might have left had been confiscated by the crown. Thomas had nothing. No money. No prospects. No future. He should have been forgotten. Another casualty of his father's downfall, left to fade into obscurity. But then something unexpected happened. Anne Boleyn helped him. Yes, that Anne Boleyn, the woman who had hated Wolsey. The woman whose whispers had helped destroy him. The woman who had become queen in the aftermath of Wolsey's failure. Why she chose to support Thomas Winter, we'll never know for certain. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was politics, a way to demonstrate mercy and gain favor with those who remembered Wolsey fondly. Maybe she simply saw a young man destroyed by circumstances beyond his control and felt pity. Whatever the reason, she provided Thomas with financial support, enough to survive, enough to rebuild some semblance of a life. It's one of history's strangest ironies. The woman who helped bring down Cardinal Wolsey became the benefactor of his illegitimate son. But Anne's support didn't last long. By 1536, she was arrested, tried for treason and adultery, and executed. 3 years as queen, and then nothing. Thomas survived her, too. He lived quietly after that. No grand ambitions. No attempts to reclaim his father's legacy. He kept his head down, stayed out of politics, and tried to live the kind of ordinary life that had never been available to him before. He married. He had children of his own, continuing Wolsey's bloodline in secret, just as his father had done. But unlike his father, Thomas didn't try to use his children for power or wealth. He simply raised them, loved them, perhaps, gave them the kind of stability he had never known. Thomas Winter died sometime between 1542 and 1546. The exact date isn't recorded. He was in his 30s young by any measure. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning, no monuments erected in his memory. He had been the son of the most powerful man in England, and he died as a footnote. But in a strange way, Thomas got something his father never did: peace. He lived without the burden of maintaining an impossible image, without the hypocrisy, without the constant fear that the lies would finally catch up to him. He was just Thomas, not Winter, not Wolsey, just a man trying to survive in a world that had never wanted him to exist in the first place. Dorothy Clancy's story doesn't have an ending, at least not one that history bothered to record. After Wolsey's fall in 1529, she simply fades from the records. No letters, no legal documents, no mentions in courtiers' diaries or ambassadors' reports. She becomes a ghost present only in the vague awareness that she had once existed. We know she was still at Shaftesbury Abbey when her father died. The convent had been her home or her prison for years by that point. But whether she stayed there by choice or because she had nowhere else to go is impossible to say. What we do know is that being Wolsey's daughter had become dangerous. In the aftermath of his disgrace, anyone connected to him faced suspicion. His former servants were interrogated. His allies were watched. His properties were searched for evidence of treason or hidden wealth. Dorothy's best protection was obscurity, and she had that in abundance. Unlike her brother, whose church positions had made him visible, Dorothy had always been hidden. She carried the name Clancy, not Wolsey. She lived behind convent walls, away from court, away from politics. For once, being forgotten was an advantage. But she wasn't entirely abandoned. Years later, when King Henry began dissolving England's monasteries and convents, Shaftesbury Abbey was one of the institutions targeted. The nuns were turned out, the buildings seized, the wealth redistributed to the crown. And Dorothy? She received a pension. It wasn't a large sum, just enough to live on. But the fact that she received one at all is significant, because pensions weren't automatic. They were granted selectively, often to those with connections or influence. Someone arranged for Dorothy to be taken care of. That someone was likely Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell had been Wolsey's protégé. He had risen to power under the cardinal's mentorship, learned statecraft and ruthlessness at his side. And when Wolsey fell, Cromwell survived by switching loyalties to the king. But he never forgot where he came from. There are hints, nothing concrete, just suggestions in the historical record that Cromwell sought out Dorothy after Wolsey's death, that he felt a debt of loyalty to the man who had made his career possible, and that helping Wolsey's forgotten daughter was a way to honor that debt. Hilary Mantel's novel Wolf Hall dramatizes this, imagining Cromwell proposing marriage to Dorothea. It's fiction, of course. There's no evidence it actually happened. But the pension, that was real. Cromwell made sure Dorothy wouldn't starve. That when the convent dissolved and the world she had known disappeared, she would have enough to survive. It was a quiet act of loyalty, one that required no public acknowledgement, no grand gestures. Just a name added to a list of pensioners, buried in bureaucratic records where no one would question it. After that, Dorothy vanishes completely. Some historians speculate she married. One source suggests a man named Robert Constable, though the evidence is thin and contradictory. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she lived out her days in quiet anonymity, grateful to be free of the convent and the weight of her father's legacy. Or maybe she struggled. Maybe the pension wasn't enough. Maybe she died young, alone, unmourned. We'll never know. What we do know is this: Dorothy Clancy was born into circumstances she didn't choose. She was hidden away because her existence was inconvenient. She was denied her father's name, his wealth, his acknowledgement. And when everything collapsed, when Wolsey's empire crumbled and his enemies celebrated, Dorothy was still just trying to survive. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a hero. She was a woman trapped by the ambitions of powerful men who never once considered what their choices would cost her. Her brother at least had wealth for a time. Her mother had been married off and given a new life, however unwanted. But Dorothy? She got nothing. No inheritance, no recognition, no story, just a name in the records, a footnote, a reminder that history doesn't care about the forgotten daughters of disgraced cardinals. She deserved better. They all did. Joan Lark outlived Cardinal Wolsey. Not by much, but long enough to see the man who had controlled her life for over a decade reduced to nothing. Long enough to know that the power he had wielded so carelessly had finally failed him. When George Legge died in 1529, Joan found herself in a precarious position. She was a widow approaching 40 with 4 young children and a past that everyone knew but no one discussed openly. In Tudor England, widows had few options: remarry quickly or face financial ruin. Joan chose survival. Within a year, she married again, this time to Sir George Paulet, a man of higher standing than her first husband. It was another arranged match, another transaction designed to secure her future and protect her children. But this marriage would be brief. Around 1532, Joan died in childbirth. She was trying to have another child at an age when pregnancy was extraordinarily dangerous. Medieval medicine had no understanding of the risks, no way to help when things went wrong. Women died in childbirth routinely, and Joan became one more statistic in a long list of maternal deaths that no one considered preventable. She left behind at least 6 children, 2 by Wolsey Thomas and Dorothy, both living separate lives far from her. 4 by George Legge, now orphaned and dependent on whatever arrangements had been made for their care. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning, no epitaph celebrating her life or acknowledging her sacrifices. She had been the mistress of the most powerful churchman in England. She had borne his children, kept his secrets, lived in his palaces. For a decade, she had been at the center of one of the greatest scandals in Tudor history, and she died in obscurity, forgotten almost immediately. The cruelty of Joan's story isn't just in how she was used, it's in how completely she was erased. Wolsey moved on from her without consequence. He married her off, paid her dowry, and continued his rise to power as if she had never existed. When his enemies attacked him, they focused on his corruption and his failures, not on the woman whose life he had derailed. Even the scandal of his illegitimate children centered on him, on his hypocrisy, on what it revealed about his character. Joan was just a detail, a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. But she was more than that. She was a woman who made choices in a world that gave her almost no power to choose. She loved a man who couldn't marry her. She bore children she couldn't keep. She endured exile, remarriage, and the slow erasure of everything she had been. And in the end, she died trying to secure a future that would never belong to her. There's a profound loneliness in that, a quiet devastation that doesn't make it into the history books because it wasn't dramatic enough, because Joan Lark wasn't a queen or a martyr or a villain. She was just a woman, and history has never cared much about women like her. By the time Joan died, Wolsey had been dead for nearly 2 years. Thomas Winter was in exile. Dorothy was hidden in a convent. The family that had existed in secret was scattered, broken, forgotten. Joan's death closed a chapter that most people didn't even know had been written. Her children by George Legge grew up without her. Her children by Wolsey never knew her as a mother. They had been taken from her too early for memory to survive. She left no letters, no diary, no record of her thoughts or feelings or regrets. All that remains is the outline of a life shaped entirely by someone else's ambition. A woman born in Yarmouth, a mistress in London, a wife in Cheshire, a body in a grave that no one visits. Joan Lark deserved better, but the world she lived in didn't deal in what people deserved. It dealt in power, and she had none. Wolsey's downfall didn't just destroy a man. It exposed a system, and the reformers were watching. Across Europe, a movement was building. Men like Martin Luther in Germany, Huldrych Zwingli in Switzerland, and John Calvin in France were challenging the Catholic Church's authority. They questioned its wealth, its rituals, its entire claim to represent God on earth. But their arguments needed evidence. They needed examples that ordinary people could understand. Stories that proved the Church had become corrupt beyond redemption. Cardinal Wolsey gave them exactly that. Here was a man who had stood in golden robes preaching celibacy while raising illegitimate children, who condemned sin while living in palaces funded by church wealth. who enforced moral standards he had no intention of following himself. He was the perfect symbol of everything the reformers claimed was wrong with Rome, and they used him ruthlessly. John Bale, an English reformer and playwright, wrote scathing attacks on the Catholic clergy. He pointed to Wolsey as proof that the entire institution was rotten from the top down. If the Cardinal, the Pope's own representative in England, couldn't follow his vows, what did that say about the Church's moral authority? Hugh Latimer, who would later become one of the most influential Protestant preachers in England, used Wolsey's story in his sermons. He asked his congregations to consider, if celibacy was truly sacred, why did it fail so consistently? If it was a divine commandment, why did even the most powerful churchmen ignore it? These weren't abstract theological debates. They were personal, visceral questions that people could relate to. Everyone knew a priest who lived too well, who collected tithes but never visited the sick, who preached poverty while wearing fine clothes. Wolsey's scandal confirmed what they had already suspected. The system was designed to fail, because the reformers weren't just attacking Wolsey. They were attacking the idea that celibacy was even possible, that forcing men to suppress natural desires in exchange for spiritual authority was fundamentally flawed. They argued that marriage was holy, that priests should be allowed to marry, to have families, to live openly and honestly instead of sneaking around like Wolsey had. And the Catholic Church had no good response. They couldn't deny Wolsey's children existed. They couldn't defend his nepotism or his wealth. They couldn't explain why a man who had broken every vow he'd taken had been allowed to rise to the second highest position in England. So instead, they tried to minimize it, to treat Wolsey as an outlier, one bad apple in an otherwise functional system. But the people didn't believe that anymore, because Wolsey wasn't alone. The investigations that followed Thomas Cromwell's reports on the monasteries, the documented cases of priests keeping mistresses, the church courts that fined clergy for incontinence, and then did nothing proved this was widespread. The corruption wasn't an exception. It was the rule. And once people saw that, trust collapsed. This is what made Wolsey's scandal so devastating. It wasn't just about one man's hypocrisy. It was about what that hypocrisy revealed, that the institution claiming to be God's representative on earth was built on lies, that the men who demanded obedience couldn't obey their own rules, that power had replaced piety. In 1534, just 4 years after Wolsey's death, the Act of Supremacy was passed. Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, breaking with Rome entirely. Wolsey's failure to secure the annulment had triggered the break. But his scandals, and those of countless others, had made it possible. Because by then, people were ready to believe the worst about the Catholic Church. Wolsey had given them every reason to. Scandals make headlines. They topple governments, destroy reputations, reshape history. But they also destroy people, real people, with lives and hopes and fears that don't matter to the historians writing about power struggles and religious reform. Thomas Winter, Joan Lark, Dorothy Clancy, they weren't political pawns or theological talking points. They were human beings whose lives were shattered by choices they didn't make. Thomas never asked to be born. He didn't choose to be the illegitimate son of a cardinal. He didn't decide to be showered with wealth and then have it ripped away when his father fell from grace. He was just a boy who grew up in the shadow of a man too powerful to acknowledge him and too ambitious to protect him. By the time Thomas was 20, he had experienced more upheaval than most people face in a lifetime. Wealth, exile, poverty, charity from a queen who had hated his father. He built a life out of wreckage, married quietly, had children of his own. And then he died young, somewhere in his 30s. No fanfare, no legacy. Just another casualty of a world that had never wanted him to exist. Dorothy's story is even bleaker. She was hidden from birth, sent away, denied her father's name, his acknowledgement, his love, if he was even capable of love. She spent years behind convent walls, praying to a God whose earthly representatives had used her existence as something to be ashamed of. When the convent dissolved, she received a pension, a bureaucratic gesture from Thomas Cromwell, who remembered Wolsey fondly enough to ensure his forgotten daughter wouldn't starve. But after that, nothing. No record of her death, no grave, no descendants that history bothered to trace. She simply ceased to exist in the written record, as if she had never been born at all. And Joan, loyal, patient Joan, got the worst of it. She gave Wolsey a decade of her life, bore his children, kept his secrets, lived openly as his mistress when doing so marked her as a woman no respectable family would accept. And when he no longer needed her, he traded her away, married her off to a stranger, sent her north to Cheshire like unwanted furniture being stored in an attic. She built a new life because she had no choice, remarried when her husband died because survival demanded it, and then she died in childbirth, trying to secure a future in a world that had never given her one. No one mourned her publicly. No one wrote elegies or raised monuments. She was buried and forgotten. 3 lives, 3 different tragedies, all stemming from one man's inability to live by the rules he enforced on others. Wolsey chose ambition. He chose power. He chose secrecy and lies and exploitation, and his children paid the price. Thomas lost his inheritance and his future. Dorothy lost her identity and her history. Joan lost everything. They weren't villains. They weren't corrupt. They were just people trapped in the gravity of Wolsey's choices, pulled down by the weight of his hypocrisy. And the cruelest part? History doesn't remember them. It remembers Wolsey. It remembers Hampton Court Palace and the Act of Supremacy and the English Reformation. It remembers the politics and the theology and the grand sweep of events that reshaped a nation. But Thomas, Dorothy, and Joan? They're footnotes, minor characters in someone else's story. We don't know what Thomas thought about his father. We don't know if Dorothy ever understood why she was hidden away. We don't know if Joan regretted the choices she made or if she loved Wolsey despite everything he put her through. We don't know because no one thought their inner lives were worth recording. They were collateral damage in a story about power. And that's the human cost. Not just the fall of a cardinal or the rise of a new church, but the quiet destruction of ordinary people whose only crime was being connected to someone more important than they were. Legacy is everything to powerful men. It's why they build monuments, why they commission portraits, why they obsess over who will remember them and how. Wolsey understood this. He built Hampton Court Palace, a structure so magnificent it rivaled the royal residences. He accumulated titles, wealth, influence. He shaped policy, negotiated treaties, controlled the direction of an entire nation. He wanted to be remembered as great. But the legacy he left was something else entirely. 2 children, Thomas and Dorothy, his heirs in blood, but never in name. They were the proof of everything he had sacrificed for power, and the reminder of everything he had lost, because Wolsey could never claim them. Not publicly, not honestly, not in any way that mattered. Thomas carried the name Winter, a deliberate distortion designed to obscure his true parentage. Everyone knew, but the fiction had to be maintained. The lie had to be respected. So Thomas lived his entire life as someone else, not quite legitimate, not quite acknowledged, existing in a strange liminal space where his father's influence could help him, but his father's name could not. He inherited wealth for a time. He inherited status until it was taken away. But he never inherited the one thing that might have given his life meaning: recognition. Wolsey never stood before the world and said, "This is my son." He never gave Thomas the dignity of truth. And Dorothy? She didn't even get that much. She was erased, hidden behind a different surname, raised by strangers, locked away in a convent where her existence could be forgotten, Wolsey never acknowledged her, never visited her, never left her anything except the lingering shame of being born. She was his daughter, and he treated her like a mistake that needed to be covered up. That's what makes this story so tragic. Not just that Wolsey broke his vows, priests had been doing that for centuries, but that he refused to take responsibility for the consequences. He wanted the comfort of a family without the burden of honoring it. He wanted children without the commitment of being a father. He wanted legacy without sacrifice. And in the end, he got none of it. Because the legacy Wolsey left wasn't Hampton Court or his political achievements. Those were stripped away, redistributed, forgotten. His legacy was scandal, hypocrisy, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition replaces integrity. And his children, the heirs he should have been proudest of, became symbols of his failure. Thomas, the boy who had everything and lost it. Dorothy, the girl who was hidden and forgotten. Both of them living proof that Wolsey had chosen power over the people who should have mattered most. There's a particular cruelty in that, because children don't ask to be born. They don't choose their parents or their circumstances. They simply exist, and they deserve to be loved and claimed and protected. Thomas and Dorothy deserved better. They deserved a father who would acknowledge them, who would fight for them, who would choose them over ambition when it mattered. But Wolsey never gave them that. He gave them secrecy instead of love, wealth instead of recognition, survival instead of belonging. And when everything collapsed, when his empire crumbled and his reputation was destroyed, they were left with nothing, not even the comfort of knowing they had mattered to him. The title of this story asks a question. What about the heirs he could never claim? And the answer is devastating. They existed. They suffered. They survived barely. But they were never truly his. Not because the law forbade it or society condemned it, but because Wolsey chose not to claim them. He chose his image over his children, his career over his conscience, his power over his humanity. And that choice defined him more than anything else he ever did. Hampton Court still stands. Tourists walk its halls, admiring the architecture, marveling at the wealth. But the palace isn't Wolsey's legacy. Thomas and Dorothy are. The children he abandoned, the heirs he refused to name. They're what history remembers, not because they were powerful, but because they were proof of what power costs when it's built on lies. 500 years have passed since Cardinal Wolsey died in disgrace. 500 years since Thomas Winter lost everything. Since Dorothy Clancy disappeared into history's shadows. Since Joan Lark died in childbirth, forgotten before her body was cold. And yet, their story still matters. Not because Wolsey was uniquely evil, he wasn't. Not because his children suffered more than others, plenty have suffered worse, but because the pattern repeats. Across centuries, across cultures, across every institution that claims moral authority while practicing moral bankruptcy. The details change. The names change. The costumes and settings shift. But the fundamental truth remains the same. Power protects itself, and the people caught in its orbit pay the price. Wolsey preached one thing and lived another because he could, because the system allowed it, because no one with the authority to stop him had the courage to try. The church knew about his children. Rome knew. The king knew. Everyone knew. And they did nothing. Because Wolsey was useful. He was effective. He delivered results. So his hypocrisy was tolerated. His vows were ignored. His corruption was quietly accepted as the cost of doing business. Until he stopped being useful. And then, suddenly, all of it mattered. The mistress, the children, the broken vows, the nepotism. Not because these things had suddenly become worse, but because they were convenient weapons to use against a man who had lost his protection. That's the real lesson here. Institutions don't punish hypocrisy because it's wrong. They punish it when it's no longer profitable to ignore. Wolsey wasn't brought down by morality. He was brought down by politics. His children weren't collateral damage in some righteous crusade for truth. They were casualties of a power struggle that had nothing to do with them. And that's the dark truth that makes this story timeless, because we see this pattern everywhere. In governments, in corporations, in religious institutions that still, to this day, protect the powerful while sacrificing the vulnerable. We see leaders who preach values they don't practice, who demand sacrifice from others while indulging themselves, who build empires on the backs of people they'll never acknowledge. We see children abandoned by fathers who chose ambition over responsibility, women used and discarded when they become inconvenient, lives destroyed by proximity to power. The technology changes, the language evolves, but human nature, that stays the same. Wolsey wanted to be remembered as a great man, a builder, a statesman, a servant of God and king. Instead, he's remembered for what he tried to hide: his illegitimate children, his broken vows, the gap between what he said and what he did. Because in the end, that gap is what defines us, not our titles or our wealth or the monuments we build, but whether we live with integrity, whether we protect the people who depend on us, whether we have the courage to be honest, even when honesty costs us something. Wolsey failed that test spectacularly, and Thomas, Dorothy, and Joan paid for his failure. Their stories weren't written by them. They didn't get to shape their own narratives or control how they were remembered. They were written about briefly, dismissively, and then forgotten. But they existed. They mattered. They deserved better than they got. And the fact that we're still talking about them 5 centuries later means something. It means the questions their lives raise about power, about responsibility, about what we owe to the people we bring into this world are still unanswered, still urgent, still worth asking. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey died on November 29, 1530. His son died young and forgotten. His daughter vanished from history. His mistress died in childbirth. All that remains is the story, the scandal, the cautionary tale, and the uncomfortable truth that nothing has really changed. We just pretend better now.